Hello, my name is Reverend Nancy Wilson, and I'm the moderator of Metropolitan Community Churches worldwide. Today I come to you as an American, as a lesbian, as a minister, as a religious leader, as a white person in this country who is struggling with the results of the verdict of the Trayvon Martin case recently. I've been reflecting these past several weeks and thinking about what ways in which I could contribute to a conversation within Metropolitan Community Church and our partners. I was thinking of the example of our President Obama, as he shared very personally about how the verdict impacted him and the ways in which he reflected on that, and how touched and moved I was by his reflection, especially his example of speaking out of his social location. I think this is so important for us in our country, where we are often so polarized, to understand that each of us speaks out of our own experience, our own culture, our own race, class, our own religious background and experiences. And to speak in dialogue with even those who might disagree with us, we have to speak authentically from who we are and where we are. I was so distressed and disappointed when I realized that part of the issues around the verdict around Trayvon Martin was the instructions given to the jury, in which they were so narrowly focused and in which they were grounded in the stand your ground laws in our state, in which for some reason it becomes possible, no matter what the context, that when someone feels threatened, they can shoot and kill the other person. I really respond to President Obama's question that if Trayvon Martin himself had had a gun, if he had been old enough to have a gun, would he have been able to stand his ground and shoot and kill George Zimmerman? I think about, what if Trayvon Martin were white? Would he have even been profiled in that experience? Someone in MCC asked me, well, shouldn't we also pray for George Zimmerman and his family? And I say, of course. We need to pray for everyone who's impacted and who is experiencing any kind of collateral damage in this terribly tragic story. But I do think, for me, for my own sense of justice, that it seems so unacceptable that someone would mistakenly profile and identify this young man as a criminal, this kid who was doing nothing wrong, and then take action that he'd been advised not to take, to pursue and chase him, and then in whatever happened between them, feel threatened, be able to pull out a concealed weapon and kill this young person. This seems fundamentally unfair and an abuse of our laws and systems. We don't live in the wild, wild west. We don't live in a place and a time where the proliferation of guns is serving us. It's not serving people of any race or any culture. We know that when people own guns very often, they often are the victims of violence because they own guns. And sure, we need to pray for everyone involved. George Zimmerman's life will never be the same. But I have to think of Trayvon Martin's parents and family. I think about that juror number one, that when she spoke of the trial very honestly and said this had nothing to do with race, that this to me says that we have a poor level of social discourse about the topic of race in our country. That someone can think that when a young African-American man who is profiled, who is prejudged to be a criminal for no reason at all, can say, this is not about race, or that she could talk about him in a way that did not see him as a child and as a person who was someone's son, but as someone who was potentially dangerous, and that she saw everything through the lens that George Zimmerman was carrying. And what we want jurors and people to do is be able to look through many lenses. That's why you want jurors that are diverse. That's why you want different points of view reflected, so that all of us, looking just through our own lens, can be challenged about our assumptions. One of the things I know about race and racism, it's not just about my personal attitudes. I may think that I have no prejudice at all, but I live in a culture and a system of laws and implementation of laws that discriminates against people of color and other minorities. Clearly, the way that our laws are enforced, who goes to jail, how long their sentences are, who is profiled in our country and communities, is not a matter of equality. I heard a story the other day about a man in Pensacola, Florida, African-American man, older, who at 2:30 in the morning was up and wanted a cigarette. And so he went out to his car, parked in his own driveway, and entered his car to be able to retrieve a cigarette and smoke it. Well, someone in his neighborhood, a neighbor across the street, called the police because they assumed that this was a burglary and that someone in their neighborhood was breaking into this man's car. Now, you can't tell me that this person didn't think that because he was black. Of course they did. They saw an African-American man opening a car at 2:30 in the morning, and for whatever reason didn't understand their own neighborhood or know that this was this man's home. The police showed up and very quickly pulled up at 2:30 in the morning. This man is shocked and surprised, and they tell him to put his hands up, whatever he did or didn't do quickly enough, and they shot him. And they didn't kill him, thank God, but they shot him in his hip. They missed him a lot, which was really great, but you think, what is it that triggers these kinds of responses? And one of the things that triggers it is racist presumptions, is that people make assumptions and then they act on them. The definition of racism is not about my personal prejudice against people of a different race. It is prejudice plus power. If I have the power to enforce my prejudice, then that becomes systemic or institutional racism. The police, who have the power to enforce the prejudice of this neighbor or themselves, assuming that this African-American man, minding his own business, just getting a cigarette out of his own car, was somehow up to no good. This goes on every single day in our country. Every single day. It happened in the Bronx recently, where a young man, unarmed, was shot and killed by the police, and the police officer really not held accountable. And I think we have to go back to the days where we're helping all of our systems, our criminal justice system, our legal systems, to understand the lens of racial prejudice and what prejudice plus power means. These are difficult conversations. They are not simple conversations. And there is really no point in ever saying this was not about race. It's always about race, in part. Just like, you know, as a lesbian, I know that homophobia plays a role in so many of my interactions. And sometimes it's a very subtle level, and sometimes it's on an institutional level. But it's always there. Being a woman, being female. We look at the recent issues of politicians who are predatory towards women, and we see that we still have fundamental problems about respect for women in the workplace. This is sexism. And there's no point in saying, oh, it has nothing to do with that they were female, or it has nothing to do with sexism. Of course it does. Of course it does. And these may not be the only factors. There are issues around power, issues around position, but we have to have sophisticated conversations around this in which we are willing humbly to say, you know, I may not have all the answers to this question, or I may want to consider the fact that people who are victims of racism or oppression may have something to teach me about what it's like to live in their shoes every single day. Why it is that African Americans in our country, for the most part, their first encounter with the police is not often that the policeman is my friend. I was taught that when I was a child, and I had nothing to contradict that experience as a white child growing up in suburban America. Nothing would ever have taught me that the police might unfairly arrest or shoot me or hurt my family. But that is the experience that so many African Americans have still in our country all these years. After the civil rights movement began 50, 60 years ago, so many years, generations, all of us hope that these issues get better generation to generation, but they don't get better automatically if we can't talk about it together. Thank you.